We're getting to the phase which we're calling full disclosure. And because of my experience and things with NASA back from 1966 to 1980 and working as well, actually, as test pilot, if you want to call it that, we were civilian astronaut consultant pilots. I was with the Grumman Corporation that built the lunar module, and our job, four of us, was to test it in the vacuum chambers, just like in space, being sure it was safe to use for the NASA astronauts. And then in turn, once we had cleared that, then that's when we started with the flying the command module, the lunar module, the Earth orbit, and then on over to the moon. So that was my main part. And then after that, I went to work over at the Lunar Receiving Laboratory and caught the astronauts coming back from the moon with the samples and supplies, and we became the director of the Data and Photo Control Department, which meant I had access to not only the samples, but the first analysis of the samples, all of the pictures, the film, and etc. So whenever they finally decided to get rid of all the extra pictures, they said, and I argued with them, I said, well, they said, go throw them away. And I said, no. I mean, we paid for them with our tax money. Well, let's give them to the universities that have a science department. And I argued with them for about 10 minutes. Finally, they said, I don't care what you do, just get rid of all but one set. That's all I needed. Get rid of them, all but one set. I did that, and I threw 3 sets in the Dempsey dumpster, which was found by a lady that saved some of them, just a few of them. And then one set I fixed up in filing cabinets, so they had a control set that was sitting there. And that 5th set, well, I had to get rid of it, so I put it in a duffel bag and I took it home and kept it. So 40 years later, whenever they started looking for people that had records and things, I came forward. Mr. Richard Hoagland discovered I had them, and then because mine are the original pictures right off of the original negatives, first generation. And when people have come to me and taken a look at it, they're flabbergasted because they can see some of the alien bases, some of the things that were on the moon that have been kept secret. What Hoagland said is because people have disappeared and died and all kinds of things that have happened because they knew stuff but they didn't come forward. He says you have one choice. Take your chances, or let's go to the Washington, D.C., to the National Press Club and present the information that you have. So we did that in 1995. And then again, we went back in 1997, and it's worked out very well. I've had debunkers trying to discredit me with the attitude that if they can show that I made a mistake or I lied or something like that, that way people wouldn't believe or look at the data. But then every time I've had the documents. That's why I started publishing my book on my history, the background, with documents to prove that what I said was true. That kind of goes back to my mother. She said, if you have something that's of value to you, why don't you hang on to it, because someday somebody else is going to want to see it. And I did.
So NASA, does it stand for never a straight answer?
You know, I kind of take credit for that. Several years ago, somebody was talking about what does NASA stand for, and it just clicked me, and I said, well, most people think it stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, but I look at it, NASA. How about never a straight answer? Because unfortunately, in fact, when the director of NASA was before Congress, and he was trying to tell stories, and one of the congressmen says, you might as well give up, because everybody knows that if your lips are moving, you're lying.
What did the astronauts used to say? Did you hear any of the gossip about what they'd seen? And
several of the astronauts have come forward. I mean, everybody knows that Buzz Aldrin has pretty well come out of the closet, I like to say. And in fact, that it was one of the reporters, oh, you never went to the moon, you didn't do that, and he got fed up, turned around and just clocked him, belted him. And that was good. More and more people are coming forward now that it's been almost 50 years. And the thing is, NASA, the government promised the people of the world that as soon as we got back from the moon, we'd share information about what was on the moon and everything else, and then they clammed up and started altering that's why the pictures and the films and the transparencies, I have 70mm Hasselblad camera transparencies, are so important because they're first generation off of the originals. And if you look at those, you can see such a difference, because we didn't have airbrushing back in the old days. They would take a print, they put a vising cover over the top, then they would paint out everything they wanted there, and then they could rephotograph. They would still have the original, but then one of the things that they said was, oh, well, we were brushing them out because people didn't want to confuse them with the stars, etc. which is not really true. They were airbrushing out. No, I didn't have airbrush. They were painting out the way of things on the surface as well as the horizon.
The artifacts on the moon, let's say the structures, are they extraterrestrial? Are they ancient civilizations maybe that break away from Earth?
How about all three? And I can cover that, because if you go to the ancient Sumerian texts and things like that, Enki and them and whatever his name was, supposedly went to the moon and set up a base there and lived there for quite a long time. There are some evidence of some ancient ruins, and I have pictures that we've zoomed in and looked at some of the ancient ruins. I've got some fantastic pictures in my archive. Coming up close to the terminator, the edge of the moon, is you next step over, you're going behind the moon instead of, not behind, into the back side of the moon, or stay on the front side. And there's a series of craters there that actually shows domes illuminated from the inside base. There's, on that one, it definitely looks like it was, you know how humans do, when we do something, we're going to line it all up nice and neat and survey it out, and we've got crisscross roads. There's over a dozen or more domes inside this one flat area on the moon, and I've got the original pictures that shows it just as clear as it can be.
What was it like the first time you saw these images? Did you just say, oh
well,
my
the first time, the aha moment is what you want. Dr. Thornton Page, who was the director of the Lunar and Planetary Science Department for NASA at the Johnson Space Center, knew me because I was the director of the Data and Photo Control Department. He came over and says, Ken, I want to see a picture of a film on Apollo 14. He gave me the number, and he said, set it up for these other scientists that I've got with, so that they can see some of the pictures on the backside of the moon. I said, sure. So I went to the photo lab, checked out the reel, went over. I got him to get me a gun sequence camera. Now, if you've ever seen movies where planes are chasing each other, shooting, and each time there's a going on, well, the camera takes a frame shot, a picture of each time the trigger's pulled, or each time a firing is. So you wind up with a video, or a movie, I should say, of the tracers going out. So I knew how to operate those since I was trained in the Marine Corps as a pilot and all those things. So I checked out the film. I went over to the building next to the mission control, set it up for them, and here we are. We're looking at the pictures on the blow up on the screen and on the back side of the moon, and we're approaching crater Tsiolkovsky. Now, for people that don't know, the Russians got to the moon first before we did, and as their satellites went around, they took pictures on the back side of the moon, and they gave names to all the good-sized craters on the backside of the moon after their Russian scientists. Whereas, go ahead.
Who landed on the moon first, though?
We did.
So the Yanks take credit for that?
Now here we have to look at that from what we have discovered now. I'd say yes, we still landed on the moon. Or you can go back and talk about did the Anunnaki were there first, et cetera. Okay. So I've got to be a little careful about what the question is. We landed on the moon. I know that the Russians tried, and they did have a crash, and they lost 2 of the cosmonauts. Okay, and I have a friend, Boris Yaroslavtsev. Then we looked at pictures that the Russians had of the crew and the other cosmonauts, and then another picture of the crew where the cosmonauts have been airbrushed out that died. So their trick is if they died, they're handicapped, not a something to brag on. So that takes care of that one. Now back to who else is on the moon, and I talked about that. I was pretty sure that when we were looking at Tsiolkovsky crater, because I tell everyone, take your hand, turn it palm up, and bring your fingers all together, and look at the domes on the top. That's basically the way those 5 domes were arranged, but they blended in somewhat with the rim of the crater Tsiolkovsky. Now, on the front side of the moon, on the terminator edge, you find there's about, I need to know exactly, about 20 some odd domes, all laid out, perfectly arranged, perfectly spaced, etc. And it wasn't until I was with a person by the name of Brett Shepard, who was going to help me write my autobiography, and I was showing him some of the pictures, and I was explaining how when the Apollo 14 spacecraft came up from the lunar surface and rendezvoused with the command module, we do what called a little bit of a dance, that we go all around and look at each other and be sure that we haven't damaged any of the equipment before we can rendezvous, we can dock. Okay, that's when I'm explaining all this. He says, he's an artist. Artists use a different part of their brain to see things than what us engineers do. He says, look what's on the lunar surface. And I go, but we're talking about the command module. He said, no, look at the lunar surface. And right on the lunar surface is this base. It's very small, from 60 miles up. And I'm looking at it, wow. So he zoomed in on it, got closer, and that's when we got the perfect looking picture of those bases. So that's just 2 of them. Since then, astronomers have come out and said, the moon is an anomaly in itself. It's too big to be going around a planet. It's the perfect size at its orbit. It can totally block out the sun. That's just 2 of the things. And the other one is for it to maintain the distance from the Earth, it doesn't weigh enough. So when we left the moon each time, first time on Apollo 11, one of the equipments that we put on the lunar surface called the ALSAP, the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiment Package, which included a seismometer, a seismic, to register any of the vibrations and or explosions and things, particularly when we rendezvoused with the command module, transferred all of the equipment from the lunar module to the upper stage to the command module. Then we remotely would separate the lunar module from the command module, fire its retro rockets so that it would then start decelerating and then going down and impact on the moon. When it hit the moon, the upper stage of the lunar module, when it hit the moon rang like a bell. I talked to a seismologist today. He said, they get 10, 15 seconds, even that much, ringing whenever they set off an explosion to see what kind of strata we have here on the Earth. But when we're talking about the bell ring like a moon for several days, okay, that pretty much says it is hollow and has a lot of structures. Another way of telling is the first time the crew were coming around the moon, coming back in, we were expecting, for instance, them to come from the backside of the moon right over here at a certain moment. Instead, it was a little slow, a little later, and it came out over here. Well, there's what we call a mass concentration of metallic. So within the lunar surface, in that area that they came over, had to have been so densely packed with whatever was there that it caused the spacecraft to deviate from its orbit slightly. So a lot of things have happened to show that the moon is not empty, not
So what about these structures? What are they made of?
What are they made of?
Yeah. Is it the rock? Is it glass?
Okay, well, the rocks and things that we brought back from the moon, some of the scientists will tell you that the surface of the moon, if it is totally a man-made, for a better term, spacecraft of some sort, giant ball, the impact of asteroids and micrometeors and things have created all this dust and thing on the surface and rocks. You're going to find the same elements on the samples on the moon. But one of the examples, for instance, helium-2 on the Earth is available but not very plentiful. Helium-3 is almost hard to find on the Earth. On the moon, helium-3 is an extremely plentiful. And so some of the samples that we're looking at may have the same minerals and things, but they're in different compounds, different compositions than what you'd find on the Earth.
So what's on the moon today? Have we got the US government on the moon today? Have we got bases actually operating from the moon? I suppose it ties into the secret space program.
Then you're going to have to go back before we actually went to the moon on Apollo. You're going to have to go all the way back to President Eisenhower when he made an agreement with, I believe, the tall grays is what some of the people have come forward and said. They're part of that. And they were offered only to, because the world, people, you have to understand what was going on. We just finished up World War II, and I jokingly say, the only way to maintain peace is to have the biggest hammer. Well, he was given a choice from the Nordic race of aliens or the tall grays. The grays were going to promise to give weaponry, etc. And the Nordics were saying, no, we won't give you any advanced technology unless it's for peaceful purposes. Okay, so
was any of these conversations happening in NASA?
Excuse me?
Was any of these conversations happening in NASA?
NASA didn't exist when Eisenhower was president. That came along.
While you was working there, though, was these kind of common gossip?
I wasn't invited. I was close to it when I was with Dr. Thornton Page and then worked with those. But then the very next day, I checked out the same reel of film that I showed to him and the other 6 scientists. And then I even told my brothers, Dr. A.R. Johnston, which was worked directly for the government and was an employee of NASA. I was an employee of the Grumman Aerospace Corporation. Yeah. So I told my brothers, come over to the the main cafeteria at the Johnson Space Center to the auditorium next door, and I'm going to be showing the same film of the backside of the moon. I didn't tell them what they were going to see. It was because I was so excited about it.
Yeah.
So the next day I checked out the same reel, okay, took it in and set it all up, and I'm showing it, and we're tracking along the backside of the moon, approaching Tsiolkovsky Crater. We get to Tsiolkovsky Crater, we go over the top of, looking down in the shuttle, and there's nothing there. I stopped the film, told the audience. Now these were the regular NASA employees and contractors and janitors, you name it, just the rank and file people, and they were excited as all get out. They're seeing the backside of the moon coming from one of the spacecrafts going around it, so they were happy as they can be. But I stopped the camera and told them I'm having technical difficulties, just a moment, and I took the film out and I checked, and there was no splicing that I could find. In 24 hours they had to have taken the 60mm film, taken out the area, enlarged it, painted out what they wanted to paint out, paint over it, put it back in and recopy it and make a copy. So I put it back in, I finished showing it, everybody was happy. I was depressed. I took the reel back to the photo lab and was checking it in, and two things happened. The photo lab had the first room you go into is where just anybody would go in and request a copy of a photograph. Are we still good? And they would get it in front. The middle room was where science people could request looking at some of the pictures and films and the negatives and the positive transparencies over the top of what we call light tables. And then the third one was the environmentally controlled room to maintain the integrity of all the negatives and film and stuff. So I'm coming in to go and put it up, and I go into the middle section, and there's a big light table, basically 2 by 4 feet in diameter, and there's 3 people there, two men and 1 young lady, and I could see them. They're over and they're very carefully painting things out on these pictures. Well, and so being in charge of the data and photo control department at the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, my attitude was, what are you guys doing? Because, we want the integrity. And one of the guys, he quipped real quick. He says, we're professional strippers. And the gal just says, well, yes, we are. We're strippers. We call that, we're painting out the things that are on the horizon, things that would be confusing to people, et cetera, and stuff. And so I'm flabbergasted. But I have to get back, so I go ahead and put it in the third chamber back into, and then I'm leaving the photo lab, headed back to the LRL, Lunar Receiving Laboratory, and I run into Dr. Thornton Page. Now, Dr. Page had lost the right eye in an accident or something, and he wore a patch down over his right eye. And I jokingly, because he looked like a pirate, right? At any rate, I said, Dr. Page, what happened to those domes on the backside of the moon in Tsiolkovsky? He's got his patch. He looks at me, he says, there was never anything there. Now, when I was showing it to him, and we were looking at those, and he had me zoom in close with the camera and back up and go frame by frame or several frames at a time. He said stop, and he turned to the other 6 guys and said, well, boys, what do you think of that? And they all had a big laugh about it, which meant they knew what to expect. He knew which camera it was and which reel it was. But now, I didn't have time to go back and do much research, because about every 2 to 3 years, contracts were over, we get laid off and have to go someplace else. Next thing you know, I find myself working for ILC, the company that builds the spacesuits and things. As I became one of their head engineers and testers in spacesuits.
What about spacecraft? Do you see alien crafts as well within these images, or is it just purely structures?
Oh yes. And in my book, Ken's Moon, it's an autobiography, but the back half gets into a lot of the pictures and things that have anomalies in them, spacecraft. I even have some copies of videos that shows when we're in orbit around the moon, tracking down below us, right past real fast. And then Apollo 15 has a great series showing the craft that came across. Buzz Aldrin talked about the craft that followed him up to the moon. What was his name? Wasn't Buzz? He died just not too terribly. The trouble I have is so many of the astronauts that were there when I was have passed on, and it's tough.
Do you think the new astronauts, like I'm British, Tim Peake, for example, one of our astronauts recently been up there.
Yep.
Do you think he's seen things?
Could he see anything? Well, we have stayed inside Earth orbit ever since Apollo 17 returned.
Why is that?
Okay. when Apollo 17 was returning, and some of the ham radio operators were tuned into the frequencies of everything going on, and lo and behold, the voice came out, and this was tracked by several, that said, "Do not return, you're not ready." Okay.
Do we mean not ready or not welcome? What do you reckon?
Kind of both, but then it depends on how you interpret it. We now know that we, after Eisenhower and the technology that they got, that we did, and then Trudeau, I think it was Trudeau, they've got together the fact that we needed to have a base on the moon. And so now we have evidence that there are bases on the moon, and the kind that we would have built versus the kind that the aliens have built on the moon.
So do you think the governments are working with extraterrestrial?
I'm sorry?
Do you think the governments are working with extraterrestrials then? Is that no doubt in your mind there's an agreement in place between man and ET?
There's no doubt in my mind, and particularly having to do with the extraterrestrials. And because, and you've got this big secret going on with the Antarctica right now.
Yeah.
You know, so the truth is out there. I'm considering this is the year of full disclosure. We're right at the middle of it, and before I'm coming out and saying I'll have to do something, but I expect by the end of November that it's all going to come forward, and that all the truth will be out there, and the whole world will be able to. It's going to be tough for people, because the hardest hit organizations on the earth, the humans, are going to have to deal with. Well, it's not going to be religions after all. It's going to be the scientists that think that they are right on the cutting edge and know more than anybody else, find out that we're thousands of years behind.
Do you think we're ready? Is humanity ready to know
Yes.
the truth?
Yes. And I somewhat agree with, because Orson Welles did that movie series on yes, I'm having a little blackout right now. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
War of the Worlds. When the aliens came there, and people, some of them panicked. And this was all a fake. But then when he did it on the radio, there were people that jumped off houses, committed suicide, and panicked. They thought we were being taken over by aliens that were going to destroy us.
Yeah.
Okay. We have matured a lot since then. Now, I don't say that humans are very untrustworthy, but by and large, as a species, we are ready to make that transition into part of the Galactic Federation of Intelligent Sentient Beings. It's time.
How is it going to happen? Is it going to be Trump? Is President Trump going to stand?
He is pushing for it.
Is he now?
Absolutely.
Was Hillary Clinton pushing for it as well before him, do you think?
Never happened.
Right, okay.
I'd hate to get into politics, but no. And now let's don't go there, because
But you see Trump being the
yes,
one to
in fact,
disclose?
I know he's already made some movements that way, and had some of our people go and give briefings to him.
Okay.
So that may be coming up here in a couple of months or so, hearing more information. So let's hope it keeps moving. I look at it this way: they tried to make contact with the governments, but the governments wanted to maintain control and all the power and all this. But based upon, and a lot of the science fiction stories and things come from good information, such as you don't interfere with the evolution of societies of an organization, the planet or something. But yet, so the government's people wanted to keep it silent and quiet. Now we've reached a point now, even though Brookings Institute said don't tell the world, this is back in 1920, I've forgotten exactly when, or 1940 something, that most likely we would discover the evidence of intelligence either on Mars, the Earth, or the Moon, and if we did, we should not make it public, because the public could not handle it. Now we've reached the point where you ask anybody on the street, well, do you think that aliens exist? Oh, sure. 99% of the people can handle it. You're going to have those that are going to fight against breathing, I guess, just because that's what they've got to do. Okay.
What's it like living with what you've seen, Ken? It must be quite hard
to all of the
to
information
digest that you've got in your mind, because some people don't believe you. You've probably lost lots of friends.
Yes, well, yes and no. Years ago, because the United States, Canada, and Great Britain did everything in the world to try to keep it all private and quiet, and wouldn't release, UFOs every night. Now they're starting to come forward. Although South America and Europe and places, they had given about 90% of all the pictures and evidence of landings of spacecraft and or videos taken from craft to craft viewing. And I worked at Vandenberg Air Force Base on the MX missile system for the Boeing company, and sure enough, one of the ones that we launched, and I got to view the pictures on as it's going up in orbit. This craft came in and going along with it, fired a beam at the top, rotated over to the other side, fired the beam on the other side, moved off, and it went into tunneling and exploded. So they've done their best. The extras have done their best to keep us from blowing ourselves up, and keep us from getting into a nuclear war. Because if we mess up the Earth, it's going to mess up the whole solar system's attraction and magnetic and orbits and the whole bit. So people say, oh well, they're going to come and destroy. They could have done that thousands of years ago. And then you're going to get into evolution, and if you look at how long it would take monkeys to turn. By the way, the monkeys and the gorillas are still here that Darwin said that we came from. Yet now, when you get into the ancient Sumerian writings and things like that, you realize that we are actually aliens. Because our DNA was tweaked with and messed with to make us more compatible to this planet and more intelligent to where we could feed ourselves or whatever. So we've made a lot of progress. We're at the point now where, full disclosure, it can happen really fast. Now it's going to be hard, be tough, because I'm kind of tired of running out of gasoline. I'd much rather have an anti-grav craft.